Thank you, Carl. So good morning to the second day of our Vilnius 700 Symposium. You all know me, I'm Bradley Woodworth of the program, Political Studies program here at Yale University. We are now gathered here for our second, in the second day of the third panel, Vilnius as a place of exile and refuge. I simply will introduce the moderator, Katerina Shmatsina, who will then introduce the speakers and then proceed with the panel. Katerina Shmatsina is a Belarusian political analyst who has worked both within Belarus and outside of Belarus. She, in 2020, had to flee her homeland. She'd been working for the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies and did not think that would cause any political problems, but it did for her. She subsequently worked as a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund and the European Values think tank in Prague. And so, Katerina, I'll just give the floor to you.
Maybe we can get
good morning. Good to see everyone here at the second day of our symposium, and I'm excited to introduce the panelists we have today. First, and we're going to talk today about certain historical and present-day aspects of the refugee and exile in Vilnius. The panelists are Laimanis Briedis of the University of British Columbia, Vera Didok of European Humanities University, and Konstantin Eggert of Deutsche Welle. We don't have sort of much time. I would like to jump to the discussion presentation rather than just talking much about the bios. I would like to ask you first, Laimanis, about maybe your view on Vilnius as a Lithuanian, and like what's your observation about the issue of refugee and exile, essentially how it looked like in the historical perspective, who was fleeing to Vilnius, and also who was fleeing out, like from Vilnius abroad, maybe to the US or overseas, and if you could give us your perspective.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for coming this Friday morning, 13. And there's a solar eclipse, right, going on somewhere?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, okay.
You can check it out. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. And I'm actually really kind of delighted that I'm sitting in this panel with the Belarusian colleagues, because I think so much in the study of Vilnius, and including mine, Belarusians are absent, to be honest, and I think that's probably the greatest weakness in our contemporary sort of conceptual understanding of the Belarusian identity and Vilnius. I mean, I'm sure for you this is nothing, so to speak, new, but there is this kind of a notion of in many historiographies, and kind of like Lithuanian, Polish, and Jewish, probably to some extent, that the kind of Belarusians are almost kind of like invisible. They're there, but they're invisible, which obviously is extremely incorrect perception, and especially if you're speaking about some kind of refugee notion and exile, in part because, as you know, if you look at the map of Lithuania, contemporary Lithuania, the map, Vilnius is really right basically at the border. So it's a kind of a peripheral city. And the border between Belarus and Lithuania, it's a hard border now, right? It's a really border that sort of kind of like by now it's basically Berlin Wall or something like that to some extent. which historically never existed. And that's probably very like key in sort of understanding Vilnius locality in terms of sort of kind of this sort of arrangement, political arrangement, territorial arrangement, because the hinterland for Vilnius is what is considered to be now Belarus, basically. So in a way, it's a natural organic connection to Belarus of Vilnius, and Vilnius is part of that sort of territory called Lithuania, Litva, however you want to call it. Nonetheless, but it's sort of organic connection to the territory and people who inhabit that historical territory. So that's one point. And what is a very important key in understanding this question of refugee and exile is that, as you mentioned, so in Vilnius, there's this very strong correlation between coming as an exile, so to speak, coming as a refugee, but also becoming a refugee. Not necessarily that it's the same simultaneous, the same either like so ethnic group or something like that, but the process of sort of of refugee process, and I think we talked yesterday, Violetta mentioned that, and everybody probably in the panel mentioned that, that this idea that Vilnius is not idea, it's in fact, that Vilnius is constantly on a shifting ground, if I want to call it. So people come in and kind of go out, mostly, especially in modern history, most for political reasons. So it's an unstable city, yet it has a presence, very kind of stability. But another issue when I started thinking about this concept is that when we talk about refugees and exile, being exile, one actually evocative term, obviously referred to kind of Jerusalem of Lithuania of the north, but I think one of the poets, the Yiddish poets, kind of mentioned this sort of haven in our exile in a way. So I guess like putting those two together actually in literally like in this notion of, so to speak, Jerusalem of the north. But what Vilnius kind of, when I look at this, but what Vilnius, so to speak, lack, this idea of who is a refugee in the city and itself. Like many cities in Europe, and especially kind of Northern Europe or something like that, and I just spent some time in Norwich, for example, in England, they have this concept that refugees come and settle and eventually become part of the city. I cannot find very much of that sort of concept that refugees from somewhere that comes from Vilnius. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that there are no refugees or into the city. So that's very important to mention. And so that's kind of perspective, my perspective. And so I'm gonna end this introduction on two notions that perhaps that are connected. One is the more poetic, another is kind of concrete in many ways. So one thing is that probably many people here know the legend of Vilnius founding with the wolf and the rest of it, some kind of ironclad wolf howling, and then the priest or whatever pagan priest interprets that this means supposed with the city, you have to build the city, Grand Duke, and the city is going to be like, famous around the world, et cetera, et cetera. To me, it was always this troubling notion about that wolf, what actually wolf means. And actually, it's just recently I encountered in Lithuanian mythology, dreaming about wolf, because this dream is very kind of referred to the more or less kind of like reflecting the Roman idea of Vilnius foundation. But in Lithuanian mythology, I encountered that actual dreaming about wolf is expecting to have strangers into your house. Now, I don't know anything about Lithuanian mythology, so I don't know anything that's sort of like if that's true or not, but hey, I'll take that. And then, there's a very, very evocative poem of Johannes Bobrovsky, a German writer who sort of spent some time in Vilnius during World War II in German occupying forces, and he has kind of personal relationship to the city, where he actually unravels that concept of strangers in the city. And when he finishes one of the ends with very poem dedicated actually to Vilnius, saying, welcome the stranger, you're going to be a stranger soon. It's kind of a biblical reference, but nonetheless, I think it's a very much sort of on the target of, so if summarized of Vilnius relationship to refugee and exile. And so I'm sure we can talk about that more. So.
Lymanus, I actually have a follow-up question about maybe if you could enlighten us, and me in particular, about certain particular examples of who was fleeing Vilnius at certain points in time. I've spent 3 years in Vilnius, and I'm very grateful to the Lithuanian authorities of like very friendly immigration policies after 2020 and how the way they host Belarusian diaspora. And I was also thinking, let's say, like walking down the Pilia Street when you see this plate that Adam Mickiewicz was there, and then he had to leave this land and like has been missing it, did not have a chance to return, even though he wanted. So I was thinking if you could bring us some maybe particular examples of who was fleeing Vilnius.
Well, I mean, it depends who was trying to occupy Vilnius. So I think that's probably the shortest answer. So there are not that many, I'm sure historians probably can correct me, but if I understand, there are not that many necessarily, well, records who's necessarily fleeing Vilnius before the so-called Muscovite and Cossack, so to speak, occupation of the city in the 17th century. In part because the city was not occupied. I mean, one thing is to remember that Vilnius was built and established as a city is hard to reach. So in itself, it was some kind of a haven, so to speak, right? So in the 17th century, when Moscow's army occupied Vilnius, we have these descriptions actually from several sources, including one of them from Jewish sources describing when the chief rabbi of Vilna actually describes fleeing to East Prussia, to Königsberg. And so it has this description that everybody was fleeing, actually, Jews and Catholics and Protestants, etc. And then, you know, so I think his rabbi's last name was Meyer or Mayer, I think. But so he ended up, for example, in Amsterdam. Now, some of the Christians and Catholics, for example, Tilko and even the St. Casimir's body, and kind of like to East Prussia. So the point is actually that everybody was fleeing, and depending on which supposed to be where from which army is gonna sort of occupy the city. Things start to get much more complicated in the 19th and 20th century. Well, not necessarily complicated, at least from our perspective, because it's closer, where, that notion of sort of who is fleeing and who's not fleeing is really based on the very often some kind of political decisions. Just to give you one example, like during World War I, for example, Russian authorities force or encourage massive evacuation, so to speak, of Lithuanian territories, and especially Vilnius too, into the Russian interior of the Russian Empire. So we have both Christians and non-Christians and Jewish, and then sort of it kind of was forceful relocating of people or moving of people, especially Jews, from the border areas. So you have people who come to Vilnius and sort of during the German occupation, substantial numbers of people in Vilnius were refugees. Now they come from historical Lithuania, so in a way, but they still were refugees. And then actually the refugee organizations were very important during the World War I, sort of establishing all kinds of movements, including Lithuania, so to speak, like independence was established, but sort of like correlating the relationships in many ways. So refugee organizations were instrumental in that kind of building of those kind of relationships between and there's kind of phenomenal aspects how those relationships would continue actually in the United States of America between, for example, Jewish organizations and Lithuanian organizations in many ways. And then during World War II, it's very important to remember that, again, a portion of the population managed to flee, especially Jewish population managed to flee Vilnius, not very great numbers, but nonetheless, quite, we have some great writers, for example, Chaim Grade, who fled Vilna. But Vilnius was also by that time already kind of a refugee city because many Jews, especially Jews from Poland, or theoretically West Poland, so from Warsaw or something like that. So we do have this sort of relationship between exactly, between, as I mentioned, kind of fleeing and then inhabiting the city. So I don't know if that answered the question, but.
It does, and I would like to ask Konstantin next, maybe to continue this topic, if you would like, also maybe about a historical perspective, connecting the Russian Empire puzzle and how it relates to Vilnius and who was fleeing as well, like Russian Empire at certain times, if you would like to touch on this subject.
Labas rytas, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me, who has no connection to academia, to the symposium. So I will speak from a very personal perspective about my understanding of Vilnius as a city of refuge, because this is my refuge for the last 9 years. Full disclosure, I'm a chap that everyone would like to hate. I'm a 4th generation Muscovite. And in this respect, I don't speak for, but of course I'm part of a Russian diaspora that formed in the last year plus in Vilnius. And frankly, it's very interesting. And this is going to be very personal, to some extent, quite a personal set of remarks, because come to think of it, my family is very closely connected to the region. Mostly East Prussia and the Commonwealth of Two Nations. Yesterday, when we had a tour of the Lithuanian treasures at the library, I looked up the map and I found in Samogitia a village which was owned my great-grandfather 16 times back in the mid-16th century. Then the village disappeared from family chronicle, probably she just sold it for debt, so, lost it while playing cards. On the other hand, when I walk in Vilnius and I look at Užupio Gatve Vienna, I look at the place where my great-grandfather studied and where he rented a room. And the house still stands, actually, that's funny. So coming to Vilnius in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea from Moscow, was for me, as it turned out now, a kind of homecoming. And I think that here we can maybe say, I'm not comparing myself, but that these masses of Russians that you see today in Vilnius, and we're all very grateful for being able to have refuge. We are a continuation of a line stretching back to mid-16th century. A lot of people know this famous poem by the Russian monarchist writer Alexei Konstantinovich Tolstoy, «Князь Курбский от царского гнева бежал, с ним Васька Шибанов стремянный». It is about Prince Andrei Kurbsky, who many consider to be the first Russian dissident who escaped Russia after being not a very good, frankly, military leader, and in wars with Litva. And he settled in Vilnius. At least King Sigismund gave him an estate near Vilnius. And from there, he conducted his famous correspondence with Ivan the Terrible, asking him to kind of moderate his policies. He was not exactly a liberal Democrat, but he was definitely a reformer. And I think that's quite significant because the first Russian dissident decided to settle in Lithuania when it was part, of course, of a wider sort of, it was not yet the Commonwealth of Two Nations, but it was close to that, so in the Grand Duchy. And I think that has a certain resonance with today to some extent. Because, and this now I'm saying as a stranger, I mean, you live for 9 years, but you're not local. And being a stranger has certain advantages, certain disadvantages. The advantage is that you can look at things slightly from the sidelines and see things that maybe quite a lot of natives just do not see, just because it's part of their life. And to me, and I'm a historian by my university education, for me as a historian who never became a historian, but still, it's very interesting. When I tell it to the Lithuanians, some of them are shy about it, but I'm not shy saying that. I think that Lithuanian society and Lithuanian political class, and Lithuanian political class to a large extent is in Vilnius, because that is the government center. They are not the, they do not correspond to the image of a country with a population of 2.7 million. They think much wider. And I think this is a legacy of the Grand Duchy and of Vilnius being a major European, one of the major European capitals in late Middle Ages and later, before the partitions. One feels it even today in, let us say, Lithuanian foreign policy. When you look at what the Lithuanians are doing, let's say NATO or the European Union, they do punch above their weight, much above their weight, because the idea of self is very much still of a significant European country with influence and with things to say. And I, as a child of another empire, because all of us Russians, even those who dislike imperialism, we're all children of this tradition. And we feel it. And actually, to some extent, we like it. We like the idea that in Vilnius, you feel that people do not think, oh, you know, what's so small and significant. No. You feel that you're in the fulcrum of politics, culture, and for a moment, think about it. 7,000 Russian refugees in the last 18 months in Vilnius, probably actually most of them within a year after the full-scale invasion. This is after all the talk about, you know, Lithuanians being Russophobic and so on and so forth. 7,000 Russians found refuge in Vilnius, most in Vilnius. This is part of my, as I see it, as someone looking from, again, slightly from the outside, this is part of a political and cultural mentality which actually sees itself as a magnet for dissidents, for people with contrarian views, for people that enrich the culture, especially the culture of Vilnius, which is, of course, a cosmopolitan, multilingual city. And it is a culture and a political class that see it as an advantage. And one feels very much welcome in Vilnius. And when you walk the streets, you see Belarusians and Ukrainians, of course. And you feel it's your natural habitat, if you wish. To a much larger extent than you will feel, I mean, in London, where I lived for quite a long time. It is, you feel, interesting enough, you feel welcome. And I think that this is, to a large extent, not only a psychological and historical consequence of the Lithuanian statehood, but it is also a policy, and it's very good. It is a pragmatic policy. We, Lithuania, we really want to welcome people who could be an alternative in a place, eventually, maybe, in a place from which the threat comes. And if it will not happen, then at least we did a good thing. We accepted people that are running away. Well, it doesn't matter. From Ivan the Terrible, from the Soviet Union, well, it was before 1940, or from Putin. And I find it a very interesting element of a wider political picture. I think that a lot of it's interesting to see how Russian refugees, quite a few of them, let's put it like that, not all, how they looked at Lithuania, let us say, a year ago and now. First reaction of people coming, from Moscow, Samara, it doesn't matter where from. Oh, well, everyone speaks Russian here. Well, I'm going to continue doing my small website or publishing my books or whatever, broadcasting. Then it's interesting, you see, a year later, people starting saying things like, "У нас в Литве, in Lithuania, in our Lithuania, salaries are so and so, while in Russia they're so and so." Then you see people starting to learn the language and basically gradually integrate. I think the Lithuanian authorities, and that's my personal plea now because we have the vice mayor here, could do more in terms of actually propagating and facilitating the study of Lithuanian language and culture by foreigners, because this is the destiny now. And one sees people, let's say, from the Middle East. My favorite Yemeni cook is also driving a taxi, and we speak Yemeni dialect with him because I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. And he feels very much welcome, just as the Russians are. So I think that Vilnius should, and Lithuania, they should conscientiously develop this capacity, because it is the legacy of an old, respected and respectful European state, and I will not hesitate to say it, an important European empire at a certain point in time. So I would like to end on a personal note. My mother, who died nearly 20 years ago, her father was arrested in front of her when she was 13 in Moscow in 1938, never to come back. And a few months before she died, I came back home quite late from a party. And she's sitting there listening to the radio. And I say, "Mama, please, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. Why don't you sleep?" She said, "Well, until you come, I won't be able to sleep." I said, "Well, I'm a grown-up man." No, I can't do it. Until you come, I will feel that I need to be present when you're back, because otherwise I'll be afraid. I said, "You know what? It's such a burden for me." I said, "I know. But the problem is, since 1938, I only feel calm when you are either this side of the door or that side of the border." Well, I carried it with me. But since 2014, this is just a legend. The fear is gone. I can wear this pin with a potentially new Russian flag after Putin is gone without fear. While in Moscow, I will go to jail for 3 years if I wave it, or even if the police sees it on my lapel. So I'd say that for me personally, for my children, and for a lot of Russian refugees for whom I speak, this is key. The fear is gone. Ačiū Vilnius.
I want to say that this, the personal story that you shared, Konstantin, it resonates with me a lot. I can definitely think of my sort of personal experiences, let's say, or what I heard from my relatives, grandparents about the Stalin time repressions in Belarus in 1930s, where you would go to sleep, you don't know what happens to you at the night, like will someone knock on the door, and you would never see those people that take. I don't want to be over dramatic, but I'm grateful that I've had a chance to spend a few years in Belarus at the times of normalization. I mean, the times of like 2016, till 2020. Working as a political analyst, as a researcher in Belarus. And then when I saw this dramatic shift, when the protests, repressions were happening, and in the first days of the protests and the major crackdown on the political activists and civil society, I definitely felt like I see how the story of the 1930s repressions revives in 3D. I remember like also going to sleep. I didn't know what happens to me because I know stories of like researchers for just writing an op-ed or writing articles using open sources. They were not even involved into some political consulting, and some of them ended up in jail. Again, I don't want to be over dramatic, but some of my colleagues I worked with are now in jail for Valeria Kostugova, for instance. She is now sentenced to 10 years, again, for being a researcher. And there are major stories like that. And when I was in Vilnius, like I would say, like first, what struck me when I just fled there in 2020 was to see how many solidarity there was with Belarusians at the time. So many like cafes and some organizations would place the Belarusian opposition white flags on their premises, and same was the case with Ukrainian flags later on. And again, I don't take this for granted, this solidarity, and also would maybe bring up that when I spent quite a lot of time like in Belarusian diaspora in Vilnius. And at certain point, you just reach this point of like when you're not so impressed, when you see like, oh, someone fled Belarus, they're now based in Lithuania. Some had the chance to flee, like to cross the border in the conventional way, let's say by the train, when the trains were still, you could still reach Vilnius by train, or many were now are sort of trying to flee through the forests and God knows how, because they're avoiding prosecution. And when you meet those people in the bar, they would say like, oh, I'm not much of a martyr, I'm not a victim, because I know there are people who have been like tortured in much worse situation behind the bars. And I do feel much, I feel like my sort of like not paranoia, but like the sense of like tension when I was in Belarus, knowing like, oh, I'm a researcher and still even this puts me at risk, even though if I'm not involved into shady or some like maybe like shady, but like some, well, in the eyes of Belarusian authorities, being an analyst and non-pro-governmental ones, you're already like shady and suspicious enough. So again, like don't want to be like over dramatic. I just want to talk to Vera about like to learn your perspective on how the Belarusian diaspora is how Belarusian diaspora is living now in Vilnius. And maybe if you could mention some civil society initiatives that you find particularly important, or the work of democratic forces, and maybe some, like if you would like some maybe references to the presence of Belarusians in the like beginning of 20th century, what trace they left now, or the heritage, the intellectual heritage they left in Vilnius.
Good morning. Thank you for invitation. I would like to just perhaps shortly underline the role of Vilnius for democratic forces of Belarus, because of course we know that on the very individual level it's important for us as a safe place. It's a place with clear conditions, and it's the first question which Belarusians answer for them if they decide where to go. But what is most important is that Vilnius became to place perhaps only one place worldwide, with the Belarusian school, with the Belarusian university, with the Belarusian parish. As Professor Veshvilaitis said yesterday, it is something that means continuing heritage. It is a place of continuing heritage, Vilnius. And for example, now Vilnius is also a place where many journalists are working, and many human rights organizations are working and collecting evidences about crimes of Belarusian regime, which is incredibly important for all of us. But I would like also to say about this painful relationships between Belarusians and Lithuanians, because yesterday it was very interesting for me that some of panelists said about Vilnius only as a city where all of the nations feel good and are in good connections, but sometimes some also controversial relationships were mentioned. And for us now, it's something like, Rustis Komontavičius, the author of the book about Belarusian history, was asked once, what is it like to have Belarusians as neighbor? Are they danger or annoying or, I don't know, helpful? And he said that Belarusian, it's a neighbor that doesn't exist at all. And of course, we know that Lithuanians think more about, I don't know, England or Germany or Poland or Rome, and in a cultural perspective. So Belarusians is not an idea that is at all interesting for Lithuanians. But now, after 2020, we had the situation when suddenly the Belarusians were there, and previously they used to be just strange people, in IKEA on weekends, shopping and something like that. But now suddenly that there are real people, and what was surprising that they understand this heritage, historical heritage of Lithuanians also as our heritage, and sometimes some drunk people tell about it in bars because they don't know perhaps the responsibility of I don't know, words said in a public place, because in Belarus you have no public place at all. And in this situation, for us as a community, it's interesting that we are in a situation of learning how to communicate, how to tell about us, how to share our thoughts. And for me, of course, or for many Belarusians, it's clear that we cannot exclude Vilnius from our collective memory, because it is here. And we have many literature works where Vilnius is present. And yesterday, of course, many examples were brought about Vilnius in Lithuanian literature. But for example, in Belarusian literature, Vilnius, there is a great novel of Maxim Haretsky. It is in the beginning of 20th century, and he tells a story about Vilnius in under German occupation, First World War, and it's a story also about worker movement. Starting worker movement, and about trade unions, and also about cooperation between Belarusians and Lithuanians. It is all about events on the eve of founding the national states, both Lithuanian and Belarusians. And for me, it's a very good example and just a brilliant literature, which I missed yesterday in our discussions about Vilnius as a place of culture and about Vilnius in literature. But what I want to say is that we are very grateful for this opportunity for us, especially for opportunity of education for our people, for our young people. There is really perhaps the only place worldwide where we have this opportunity. But I also want to say about others, because there are not only Belarusians and Ukrainians in Vilnius now who are in some way more acquainted to you, but there are also other migrants who came through Belarus, who pushed through Belarus, or I don't know, perhaps some of them we are provoked to take this tour, and I ask me, perhaps nowadays Vilnius starts in Pabradė, in this detention center. In these centers where people are detained because they take this route, and for us as Belarusians, it's incredibly important because we know that they were making to this living weapon in this hybrid war against the European Union. And we want to know more about these people, about their tour and what happened to them in Belarus, especially, and we try to find it out at university in one research project. And I want to just tell you an example of an artist from Congo. I saw his work in an exhibition in Vilnius University 2021. It was organized by an NGO, Senus Group. And in this work, he just wrote some quotes from the Bible in French, and he draws some pictures. And I thought it is exactly in this year as Vilnius celebrated 500 years of printed book. And this person was sitting in this detention center and just trying to make a copy, a copy by hand of Bible. So for me, it was a moment where I thought that it's really like, in Gaveli's Vilnius poker, that the time of this Neris is always bringing us back.
A little bit. Yeah. Yes, that there are other refugees, and that's part of Vilnius' story now too. It's always been so.
I was gonna say that Belarus is in many ways like a troublesome neighbor for Lithuania, and I think I'm thinking about the debate about the Astrovets power plant, the construction of this interesting nuclear power plant at the Lithuanian border, and the whole debate, like the Belarusian environmental organizations were strictly against this, or the analysts, non-governmental ones, were arguing that this is, let's say, like a Russian geopolitical project. And there were other tensions that or troubles like caused by the Belarusian regime to the Lithuanians. And I'm thinking also about the beginning of the war, 2022, when Belarusians, along with Russians, they were started experiencing certain maybe hatred or discrimination in certain EU countries. And I know, let's say, a story of a political prisoner, like a Belarusian political prisoner who migrated to one EU country, and then his car was sort of damaged by by citizens of this country, not Lithuania, who they just saw the Belarusian plates and they said, like, well, you're a co-aggressor, you should go back and I don't know, stop the Russian aggression, etc. And I want to underscore that it has not been the case in Lithuania. And I recall the statements of Vilnius mayor and other government officials who were saying that these people who reside here, be it Russians or Belarusians, they are complying with the laws of our country and they deserve the right to be here. And we do not tolerate blunt discrimination and allegations. And again, like I'm very thankful for that. And I wanted to ask our panelists, let's say when like maybe we'll ask your Lymanus, your perspective maybe as a Lithuanian, how it looks like, let's say, when so many people are coming to your country, and again, like when there is this contradiction, or like a contradiction in terms of like political tensions, or there could be like some troublesome neighbors coming in, and in terms of maybe political or public opinion. What I mean by that is, let's say I studied at a certain point what was the media coverage or the public attitudes of Lithuanians towards hosting Belarusian democratic forces. And again, like in large scale, the Belarusian democratic structures have to rely on funding they got from Lithuania or other like funds from let's say like European EU sources, EU taxpayers' money. So like it's also like a point of tension. On one hand, you would like to maybe abstractly express solidarity, but then it also could be like a very unpopular move or a point of tension. And in those, let's say, like studies that I saw, or in certain like analysis I did, was a gradual shift or a sense of fatigue of Lithuanians with like how long we're going to host them and like what's the result of their work. Because like they could have been like the public opinion could have been optimistic in the beginning of 2020, but then gradually like how long you're gonna just support this and how efficient are they? I don't want to be like maybe overly critical, but also not overly idealistic about like the presence, let's say, of Belarusian diaspora's political structures here, and then the how it looks like from the Lithuanian perspective.
Personally, I cannot comment on Lithuanian perspective because I don't live there. So I think that's the question that's pretty much tied up to the sort of notion that we talked to some extent yesterday. And in case of Vilnius, I always talk about that. Whom Vilnius belongs to? Who is the right owner of the city? Now, this is a really very awkward question because in the way you don't ask for many cities, especially capital cities, that kind of question. But in Vilnius, historically, that's a very much valid question. Not necessarily politically, but in terms of linguistically and language, so to speak. I think we kind of like pointed to that direction. And, 10 years ago or something like that, I was asked a question on Lithuanian radio about what's the future for Vilnius? And I kind of like pointed to sort of heresy that I said, well, judging from history, the future is that, the city's going to change. Some other people are going to live who are probably not going to speak the language they're speaking now, because that's the history of the city in many ways. So, then again, I think this question you pointed, we live in this world with, as you pointed out very rightfully, that this sort of notion of refugee is such a sort of multi-complex, in many ways global sort of concept. Is it hard for me even to say that, for example, Belarusians are refugees, so to speak, in Vilnius, right? Because I mean, it's kind of, as I mentioned, it's part of this historical, cultural territory entity. So is it more refugees, than somebody, Jewish refugees, for example, 100 years ago from, the border between Germany and Russian Empire that's kind of like moved to Vilnius or Vilna. So I don't know. It's a very convoluted question that probably not even allowed to think about that. What's the future? Because we think always about the future that's very fixated, that this is what it is now, has to continue. Well, as we know in history, that never happens. So that's the shortest answer.
Thank you. And maybe I would like to address the same question to Diara and Konstantin. If you have thought about this, again, the balance, maybe how it looks like to reside in Vilnius, or thinking about the diasporas that have been hosted here. And there is a controversy, right? Like the political tensions, or there is, of course, a difference between the opposition or pro-democratic activists who seek refuge, but then there are also, let's say, special forces or like the KGB folks in Belarus who try to sneak, and they do operate in one way or another in Lithuania, right? Also because there are so many opposition groups residing there. Or maybe same with like Russian diasporas. I just wanted to slightly touch on this potential like tensions and yeah, like any thoughts you might have on this?
Well, before I share my thoughts, not many of them, frankly, I want to say that for me, the only problem with the Belarusian diaspora in Vilnius is something we discussed yesterday at a cocktail. In the Belarusian bar on Gedimino Prospect, they pour you Johnny Walker Red and tell you it is Japanese whiskey. That's the only problem I have with Belarusian diaspora. As for the tensions, well, yes, I think that frankly, the only real tension, I think, surfaced after not the beginning of the war, but the beginning of the second stage of the war, the full-scale, what we at Deutsche Welle call full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Putin, by Russia. And that is, I think, actually, I feel the only real point of tension when Lithuanians, not only Lithuanians, I mean, you go to Tallinn or Warsaw, you may hear the same thing. When you say, oh, you know, I'm a refugee and I can't go back to Russia or Belarus, you're saying, well, you know, it's nothing compared to what Ukrainians are suffering now. And frankly speaking, that's true. And I think that both Belarusians and Russians are carrying and will continue for the foreseeable future to carry the burden of association with the Putin and Lukashenko regime, even if you are a critic, an activist, journalist. People in Central Eastern Europe see you as partially responsible for what happened, especially to Ukraine, but actually for the threat that, let us say, Putin and Lukashenko, being his ally, are now posing to Europe. And frankly, I accept personally, I can only speak from a personal perspective. I can't speak for 7,000 Russians and whatever, many more Belarusians. But from a personal perspective, I accept it. Because until 2014, when I moved to Vilnius, and then again, it was voluntary exile, I could go back before the designated foreign agent now come. Yes, we were part of that scene. We were living in Moscow, we were running our media and trying to deal with the authorities. We were not revolutionaries. I won't say I'm not a hero. I left because I felt that I don't want my children to grow up in this hysterical neo-Hitlerian atmosphere of quasi-patriotic hysteria after the Crimea. But yes, of course, we carry this responsibility. And I think that this is especially against the backdrop of the war. It is a justified complaint by our Lithuanian posts or Latvian or Estonian. But what I think is different in Lithuania, as opposed to the other Baltics, and I travel quite a lot in the region for work, is that in the end, I know probably a couple of cases where people were addressed impolitely in the street or in a shop or whatever. Generally, I think in Vilnius, people do separate between the regime and the individuals. And this is very important. I think that it's also part of the Lithuanians and the Lithuanian political class, which is mostly in Vilnius for obvious reasons, feeling much more secure in their identity as an important European country. And that is something that's very soothing. because you want to be a refugee, you want to be protected by people who know who they are. And that is, I think, a very important point for, well, at least for me, personally speaking, as someone who lives in exile and may never go back home in my lifetime. I think we have to have some humility, accepting the fact that everyone was before had something to do with the regimes that built up. I think Belarusians, they have basically, they should be blamed less than the Russians. Because in the end, even if you're talking about the Astravets power plant, well, this is Lukashenko and Putin, and this power plant being imposed on Minsk by Moscow. I mean, what can you do? So I think that the Belarusians are actually should be treated much more kindly than the Russians. But generally, I think, look, if you're talking about tensions, let it be the tensions you have in Lithuania rather than in other places. You know?
Konstantin, you speak as a big brother. It makes me angry.
No, I just want to take more of the blame.
Okay, I want to say that for us as Belarusians, we have to learn a lot in this situation, and for us, it's only important to know what value we share with other people, and it's the most important. Whatever we do, whatever we participate in, we have to know who is sharing our values, and. I want to say that for us also it's a situation where now, for example, this discussion on the level of Seimas began about Litvinism and on the level of historians, which is very good because I think that we can just learn more about each other and tell it about each other, and it brings me to this, you know, at the beginning, after our revolution 2020, a theater was invited to Vilnius to make a co-production. It's called Breathe Together, and for us now it's the situation when we try to breathe together and to know each other more, and of course we need time to do it.
I was going to ask you about.
Can I add something?
exactly.
Because I think we have some questions, and we'll have time for questions. But I since we're here at Yale, I would like to first of all thank a person who became refugee, Benjamin Harshav, who was here at the university, a professor, and I think it's really, you know, I don't think that we mentioned. And just to give you an idea of what I was talking about, this sort of notion of refugee, he was born in Vilnius, grew up in Vilnius, and became a refugee at the beginning of the Nazi invasion to the Soviet Union. And it's a very complicated story, but he continues to be a refugee until he settled in Israel and became a professor there of Hebrew literature, I believe, if I'm correct, and that's Slavic comparative literature. And I think in the 90s he came here, am I correct, to something like that, to Yale? But the point of Benjamin Harshav, for me, for example, personally, this is speaking actually about a certain knowledge that thanks to him, we have a phenomenal thing, is the diary of the Herman Kruk, of the Vilna, you can call ghetto archivist and librarian, who himself was a refugee. He was a refugee from Warsaw, so he is not a local, and so he, you know, when he ended up in Vilnius, so to speak, and could not escape because it was literally like, I think Herman Kruk even had a U.S. Visa to go, but he couldn't get like visa from Sugihara or something like that. So anyway, so he could not leave. His family was left in Warsaw, and he, when you know. Were forced to move to ghetto along all the Vilnius, and not just Vilnius Jews, but you know, many other refugees. He became librarian and archivist and diarist of this, and it is probably the biggest source of knowledge in many ways of war in Vilnius. So in a way, it's a kind of like that's exactly what it is, a kind of refugee of the refugee of the refugee, and how it's kind of becomes, and now it's a fundamental in our understanding what was going on during the Nazi occupation, and especially in Vilnius. So on that note, I think it's.
Thank you, Lemonis, and I wanted to open the floor to the reactions, questions from the audience, because I think that would enrich our discussion and maybe provide some perspectives we haven't touched on in our panel discussion. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Ash Maria. I'm a PhD student in comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm asking this question from a place of love for Vilnius. I'm a Lithuanian Jew who learned Lithuanian after discovering my great-grandmother's passport from Kovna. But just building off of what Vera said, and I really appreciate you saying, I'm extremely skeptical of the claim that Vilnius is a city that welcomes all. I think the example that you provided of the imprisonment of folks from Southwest Asia and North Africa is a really crucial example. I also said Lithuanian Jew. I also think like the uncritical or the uncomplicated celebration of people who participated in partisans or forest brothers makes it complicated for Jews like myself to feel comfortable turning back to Lithuania. And I also am skeptical when you talk about a celebration of Europeanness and how the Lithuanian language is coded within a language of prestige, and how this understanding of prestige creates a hierarchy between cultures and languages. And I would just really appreciate it if you could address this paradox I see between celebrating what I see as like Europeanness or whiteness with also being a multi-ethnic country that is supposed to be this, new global diverse capital.
Wants to address this question?
Is that for all of us?
Anyone who wants to answer, yeah.
Anybody? Well, I can answer the question. I'm not sure. First of all, I don't think that, well, I don't know, I can speak only for myself. First of all, I really never said there's any kind of weak celebration or whatever, cosmopolitanism or something like that, or international in Vilnius, or for that matter, Lithuania. I think it's a very valid point, what you're making. This is a question that Lithuanian society, Lithuanian culture, and probably citizens of Vilnius have to reevaluate how they see the otherness in itself, where actually, I mean, for me, and I can speak for myself, as you mentioned, the fact that you, for example, feel uncomfortable in Vilnius is precisely the point that need to be reflected on. And the reason why you need to be reflected on, because, how we define who is the, so to speak, the other, so to speak, right? So if Vilnius can think about itself, which is very difficult, that, Jewish culture is not something like other culture, Jewish presence in the city is not something other, then maybe there's a possibility to move forward. But honestly, it's very hard, and what it always comes, actually, in my opinion at least, one of the difficulty about this is all about kind of translation. The difficulty in Vilnius, and it is a difficulty, we all talk about this polyphony, how great it is. Actually, difficulty is precisely that it's like all the communication in many ways has to go through some form of translation. So in a way, for Lithuanians, for example, to understand Jewish presence in Vilna, they have to tap into some kind of translation, because they can't get access to Yiddish sources. Maybe some of them can read something English or something like that. So that has to be translated into basically Lithuanian. So Lithuanian language and Lithuanian culture has to make that Jewish aspect of Vilnius part of, so to speak, of their own, not to claim it, that they own it. So maybe that would be the good beginning to address, not even address necessarily, but to kind of reflect literally on those questions. So I don't know if that helps you to answer, but it's, yeah.
Let's put out the mic. I want to ask an insider's perspective from Viera and Konstantin. because, for example, when it comes to Belarusian diaspora, there have been waves throughout last decades, right, of migration to Vilnius for political purposes, right? And naturally, there are different relationships that happen between those cohorts or generations of refugees from Belarus residing in Vilnius. They have certain points of history, memory, heritage, right? They may go to the same parish, may study at the same university, go to the same Belarusian school, whatnot, but still, there are differences. What is the nature of relationship between them? Is there any difference? Do Belarusians who moved to Vilnius before it was cool in 2010, do they feel like they own it more than those who moved just after 2020? And similar to Russians, because there are those who moved after Bolotnaya, there are those who moved just like you after Crimea, there are those who moved only after 2022. Is there any dynamics of relationship between those who did it way before and those who just moved? Is there any tension, or in the contrary, what's the dynamic of that relationship? Thank you.
For Belarusians, a very important period was in the 90s years, as Nasha Niva newspaper was published in Lithuania, in Vilnius. And it was the time when Belarusians learned a lot about Vilnius and about Lithuania. And of course, for us, we are in a situation where we can build on this experience and build on this knowledge. For example, we have in culture community, create culture space. They are sitting in the building where Moishe Kulbak lived in 20s years. And it was the reason why they resided in this building. And of course, I think that we are in a better situation than others, perhaps, because we can really relate to this experience of others, other generation. And we have many works translated into Belarusian from Lithuanian. Tomorrow in Vilnius will be a festival of Belarusian literature with some presentations of translated books, and vice versa. Belarusian literature is translated a lot into Lithuanian by Marius Burokas and other translators, which is a great work, and we appreciated it a lot.
I think that to some extent, Maxime, the answer was in your question. Yes, of course. People that moved, as you said, after the Bolotnaya protests, which is give or take 12 years ago, and also are different. First of all, some of them are already citizens of Lithuania. But for me, there is an important element when I speak to the Russians that moved, that basically signifies this, I would say, progress to some extent, or this internalization and adoption of a new place. That is when they, even in their day-to-day conversations, they stop using the word Pribaltica and they start saying the Baltic states. And that is when it becomes automatic, when it's not only for consumption, when you come to the, Migracias Departamentas and you have to do this and that, no. Then you see that these people are kind of becoming integrated. Because it's difficult to learn Lithuanian. It's a difficult language to some extent because you have to go back to your, because of the Indo-European roots, you have to go back to your desk as a school child and learn again about cases and stuff like that.
I want to ask, do you really believe that the majority of Russian speakers in Lithuania now who come, whatever, are integrated already?
No. What I'm saying for me, Lyman, it is a sign, but I'm talking individually to people. You see that it's moving on.
Moving on in what direction?
In the fact that they settle down there. I'm not saying they will become Lithuanians. They will not.
Right. And you do understand that that is in itself, it's a, I'm not arguing that it's correct or something like that, but it's an emotional and psychological threat for Lithuanians.
Yes, I think for some Lithuanians, yes, for some men. I met those who don't think it is a threat. But again, when you asking me about that, then let me ask you back. What do you suggest? We'll go back to Russia.
No, I don't suggest anything. I'm just asking a question that you paint this picture that somehow is like, settling in Lithuania and not becoming Lithuanian, so to speak, and I don't know for how long or whatever, that is from the Lithuanian perspective and from the sort of, I honestly, I like would never imagine that I'm gonna start to protect some kind of like Lithuanian sort of kind of emotional or relationship, for example, to Vilnius or something like that. But there is, when I go to Vilnius now, and I don't live there, whatever. When I go to Vilnius, and it's obviously that Vilnius becoming much more Russian-speaking place, I have to say it's a very bad deja vu. And I think it's for many Lithuanians that it is, and we have to understand that. Now, we might start to kind of work with those our emotions and what feel something one way or the other, but there's nothing to suggest in that it's such a great thing.
Look, we have different perspectives on that. First and foremost of all, if you're talking about the presence of Russian speakers, and that's not only people from Russia.
No, I know. So
first of all, it was a political decision to let them in, right? We asked, we were given permission. That's very simple. That's how it works, right? No, let me finish. That's number one. Number two, I understand all the sort of emotional memories and historical memories of occupation and stuff like that. I understand very well. Now, people, and that's why I said it, people will learn the language. People, I think their children will be much more part of the place if they stay, of course. But of course, when I die and I'm buried, you will not be able to say this is a Lithuanian who died. No, I am who I am. And I'm not pretending to be anything else. But again, I think that what I find interesting is that when you do show respect and understanding, and lots of Russians, even those who came now, those who are, anti-Putin, pro-democracy, whatever, they don't know much about the history of the Baltic states, generally in Lithuania in particular. When they learn about it, for many it is a revelation, deportations and stuff like that, because they know about it somewhere in the background, but not really. But again, when you settle down there, your only option is to either move on, some do, or go back. Well, you can't go back. I understand that it's a problem. What I'm saying is that it is a problem that will have to be managed by everyone.
Right.
Or deport us. It's not a problem.
No, I'm not deporting anything.
Well, we have representatives of the Lithuanians.
I'm not like so please do not start,
maybe I don't understand what you want to say. But...
If I may step into this discussion as somebody who lives in Vilnius, somebody who lived in Moscow and did my first studies there, I'm really aware of the changes that are brought by Russians in Vilnius. It's true, Vilnius became, actually, especially in last year and a half, much more Russian speaking. Not just because of Russian influx, but also, of course, Belarusian and Ukrainians that also speak Russian, so that center also looks like much more Russian speaking because Lithuanians on weekends and in summer leaves are leaving for countryside to their country houses. Students go whatever abroad, home, and Vilnius center is very much populated by Vilnius University students. So all that landscape is changing, but I can say what me who know Russian pretty well, I have no problem to speak Russian, started reacting to, it's when somebody starts speaking to me in Russian without any introduction. Then I don't hear it. Because any other in Polish, in English, sometimes first ask, do you speak English? And if somebody asks me, do you speak Russian? That's absolutely fine. If I'm just addressed in Russian, I don't respond because that's pure imperial attitude. And it's happening, unfortunately, it's happening. And it's really very hurtful. So my approach is I speak Russian when it's convenient to me and not to somebody else. Because I learned Russian not because of my choice. We had to learn it. Us when, sometimes you have to explain. So once we come to that understanding, I think there will be no problem. But some problem there is. Thanks.
So when I was in Vilnius this summer, I purchased a book whose title I didn't understand at first, but then I looked it up, and the title of the book is Gudžios Istorija, the history of Belarus in Lithuania. I don't know how widespread. This looked like a book that could be used as a textbook in school. So my question, though, is from the other perspective. I guess this would be for Vera Zebruk and Shvatsi now. Right now, the political pressures, the East-West political pressures that Professor Snyder talked about yesterday, are dominating everything. There will be political change. There will be some other different kind of Russia at some point. We don't know what it will be. But the closeness and the affinities that are potential now for Belarus to the north and to the south, to go back to that old north-south axis, even though it's maybe some 300 years old. So does that have a potential to develop into something new, this north-south axis, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine?
Yes, like the short answer is yes. I'm thinking about the geopolitical orientations or the aspirations that Belarusian democratic forces have been expressing, or I don't want to talk here maybe about the notion of European integration and stuff like that, but I just want to underline, because this could be also controversial, but I want to underline that many democratic initiatives or opposition parties, they have this notion of European geopolitical orientation in their founding charters. So this notion is not new, or the notion of turning or linking the historical heritage, the underlying common heritage with Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine is not new in the Belarusian historiography or in the, let's say, the narratives adopted by the Belarusian democratic forces. So I think that in the future, it's not it's not a question if this would happen, just when it happens and when Belarus has a chance to make their own sovereign choice to sort of decide their faith.
I would like to add that a month ago, while the Congress of Belarusian Studies in Gdańsk, this question was discussed by experts, and they discussed this idea of Baltic, Black Sea region, and the short answer of them was that economically there is no reason to see it as a region, because our countries are too different economically, Belarus and Lithuania or Latvia, whatever, but politically it still is an attractive idea, and I think that many democratic political are thinking about it.
Yes. Again, I think you touched upon a very important issue politically now. It's interesting that when you're in Kiev, and I was there 3 weeks ago, last time, this notion, although we all know that this idea of 3 seas and so forth, it's a bit of a controversial thing in Kiev, or used to be. but let me put it like, not speaking for Ukrainians, but when you speak to people from the, decision makers or opinion makers, it's very clear that it's become, let's put it like that, more attractive in Ukraine after the full-scale invasion. Because basically this idea of reliable partners, security partners, is very much in the minds of decision makers in Kiev, and that impacts the thinking in the end. So I'm not saying it's going to be like a new Commonwealth, something like that, but evidently it's clear that the idea of having tighter security connection with countries of the Baltic Sea region and Poland and so forth is there. So it is definitely a north-south axis, and I leave aside Belarus because it's clear that under this regime it will not be part of anything. But the idea is definitely there. It's really interesting if you look back at Norman Davis's book Forgotten Kingdoms that he wrote like 7 years ago, so discussing Litva and the Commonwealth as part of the past that is projected into the future. That you see it now when you go to Kiev, to Odessa. It's there. Well, I'm not speaking for Ukrainians, but it's my impressions as a journalist that definitely it is very much a practical consideration today.
So we have time for one final question from the audience. Yes, please.
Could you comment, maybe Vera Constantine specifically? I think Vilnius as a place of refuge coincides immediately with Vilnius as a potential place for dissidents. Could you comment on Vilnius as this place for that potential?
Well, I don't know. I think that, I don't know. I think I kind of touched upon it in my remarks. Personally, again, I'm only speaking from a personal perspective. It is a place where one does feel secure, and as a refuge, quote unquote. Truly, I mean, again, I don't want to touch upon anything apart from a personal experience. It is really a good refuge. You feel that you can work there, you feel you're secure. Actually, it's interesting, since you ask. Katerina mentioned infiltration by the security services. Of course, it's a question for the Lithuanian security service, the VSD. But the feeling in Vilnius is that it's not, let's put it like that, you don't feel like you have to think whether you're being shadowed or whether there is infiltration, there's no doubt about it. But I don't think it's huge, because I think that one also feels you're being protected by a state which has its security apparatus in order. And that is important. It's impossible for me to imagine that, for example, there are no agents inside the Russian opposition, and like 7,000 people, of course there are. I'm sure the same about the Belarusians, but I think the degree is important, and one somehow feels that even in this aspect, the Lithuanian state is doing a good job. That is my personal, again, impression. So, yeah, it is a good refuge.
I was asking more on the topic of kind of forming dissident movements or continuing dissident movements in terms of someone who is coming from a Russian background, someone from a Belarusian background. In terms of...
It's a whole huge other topics, at least with regard to the Russians, as to are they capable of forming anything. Personally, I think they're not very good at that, because where you have 3 Russians, they have 7 political parties, and there's a lot of ambition. Personally, I think that there are good conditions for work, for launching media. The whole of Khodorkovsky media organization is working from Vilnius. Media Zona works from Vilnius. There are lots of important alternative media voices that work out of Vilnius. If you're talking about political organization, I think that depends not so much on the place. Although, yes, you do feel when there's a congress of Russian opposition people, you feel it is kind of secure. You don't feel some thugs are going to come and throw bricks at you. If you're talking about just physical security. But if you're talking about setting up new stuff, well, I'm a refugee, but I'm not a politician. And personally, I think that the current wave of Russian emigration is there to ferment ideas, to create things, rather than take power. I do think that pretty much everyone who is on the scene today will never be in any kind of executive positions inside Russia when Putin leaves the scene. We're not discussing what's going to happen after he leaves, because no one knows. But personally, I think that those people that are in opposition today, I don't think they will be really running Russia, even if Putin is gone today. I think it will be other people. But what is important is that outside of Russia, not only in Lithuania, of course, since we touched upon that, you discuss things which you cannot discuss inside Russia, for that matter, inside Belarus too. And that is a very important thing, because in the end, ideas, they filter back. They filter into new discourses. Even if all these people, the Navalny's, the Khodorkovsky's, so on and so forth, will not be in the Kremlin. So I think that is maybe the good thing that comes out of the immigration. And I think it's probably relevant to other immigrations. But again, I don't want to talk for anyone else, but for what I see inside the Russian diaspora. I hope I answered the question. Thank you very much.
So I would like to wrap up this panel discussion, and also to underline that we've covered sort of certain optimistic views or the positive aspects of, again, like Refuge and Exile. And I personally have enjoyed this little heated debate that we've experienced during our panel. And it certainly gives me some food for further thought and again, like valuable insights. Like, I'm personally very happy that we had this little debate, because it underlines that encourages me personally, let's say, to think about to think more, not only like in the idealistic terms when we talk about multiculturalism and refugee issues. Thank you so much for your attention and for your thoughtful questions, and of course to our panelists for all your contributions. Thank you.